Hey there, I'm Rachel Ehring, and you're listening to the Top Music Piano Podcast. Get inspired as we discuss creative resources, trends in piano pedagogy, ways to grow your income and streamline your studio, and new ways to engage your students each week. If you are a teacher who wants to go beyond the method books to create an innovative studio that fosters lifelong music makers, you've come to the right place. Hello, piano teachers. If you are a solo teacher with a wait list and you have ever thought of hiring teachers or renting out a commercial space, you're going to love today's episode. My guest is Katie Crist, and she gives so many practical tips from her experience of starting, growing, and eventually selling a multi-teacher music school. Here's a little about Katie. Katie Crist is an entrepreneur, performer, and business coach with a talent for creating systems that work and businesses that thrive. Katie's journey began in classical ballet, training with the Royal Academy of Dance and Patrick France of the Paris Opera Ballet, before transitioning to a successful music career. As a background vocalist for Jessica Simpson, she performed at legendary venues like Madison Square Garden and appeared on shows such as The Late Show with David Letterman and Dancing with the Stars. For over a decade, her voice brought Barbie commercials to life as she recorded jingles for Mattel. In 2012, Katie founded the Music Box in Lafayette, Louisiana, where she built a vibrant music school that became a hub for aspiring musicians. After more than a decade of growth and innovation, she sold the business to Ensemble Performing Arts and shifted her focus to helping other business owners succeed. Today, Katie works with music school entrepreneurs around the world, guiding them through growth, simplifying operations, and strengthening their culture. Known for her creative approach and practical advice, Katie brings valuable insights that resonate with audiences in any industry. Here's my talk with Katie. Hi, Katie. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here. I would love to have you introduce yourself and tell us just a little bit about you and your business.
Well, I'm happy to be here. So my name is Katie Crist. I live in Lafayette, Louisiana. I grew a music school called the Music Box over a 10-span decade, scaled it up. We, employed about 25 teachers, all before selling it to a national group called Ensemble Performing Arts.
Great. So I am so excited to talk to you today about multi-teacher studios. I know you have so much wisdom on this topic. So we're just going to dive right in and hear what you have to say. So I would love for you to talk to the teacher who's considering taking this leap into becoming a multi-teacher studio. I think that a lot of my listeners have thought about it or maybe even taken some of the first steps, but they're not quite there yet. What advice do you have to kind of get the process going and as they envision what they want their business to look like in the next 5 years or so?
Yeah. So, it is kind of a natural progression of a music academy. Most of the time, those academies start with a solo teacher who's passionate about teaching, and they grow and they're sold out and they all of a sudden have a wait list. And then that's where most of these listeners are at that point where they're like, now what? Yeah. So one of the things that I learned the hard way, which I think that's, one of the gifts of being able to share knowledge after experiencing, is listening to things like this. You learn more quickly. The learning curve is shortened. But it's really important that you understand what the market rate is for just general music education in your area. I think that's a really good place to start so that you can understand, what teachers are paid in my area and how do I make this money math work?
Yes. Oh my goodness, the money math. And we're going to get more into that for sure, because I know that people are really interested. But before we do that, what are some of the very first decisions that need to be made as they're making this transition or thinking about making it?
Yeah, so let me kind of zoom backwards and remember what it was like when I first hired my first teacher. So you're likely in a space where you're just there by yourself. I imagine that most solo teachers are either teaching in their homes or in a very small commercial space. Maybe they just rent a small office space and have their instrument there and their students meet at this office space. So figuring out, okay, the space that I have now, what needs to change or increase to allow me to take the next step to bring somebody back in to join me on this, adventure of teaching together. So that would be the absolute very first step, is like space. Where am I going to do this?
Yeah. And there's so many options when you're thinking about this, because you could have, like, I have a friend who hires teachers to either travel teach or teach out of their own homes. So, that's one option. Then there's the small commercial space. Then there's bigger commercial spaces. What could you tell us about renting commercial spaces? Because I know that's a big question that comes up.
Yeah. So it feels like a very scary decision when you do it for the first time. We started as a kind of sub-service, like an independent service of a talent agency. And it was kind of neat because I had just moved from Los Angeles to Louisiana, where my husband's from. And this friend of mine had a talent agency, and she's like, we're prepping these kids for this expo. Can you come teach here on site? We have this little tiny closet room. So that's where I started, solo teacher. And over a year, it grew. We had a wait list. And so I was onto this venture of looking for my first commercial lease. I was so intimidated. But what I knew was that this was something that had legs, and I wanted to explore the growing of the business. So, it's great to get a realtor, but it's also great to just drive around and see what's out there in your area. Like, look at the parking lot. That's a big one. Because you imagine the clients, particularly in the private lesson model, it's like every 30 minutes, there's a new group of students. It could be a pair of students. It could be all the way up to 10 students in and out every half an hour, depending on how many rooms you have. And look into options that you can sign a short-term lease. 2 to 3 years is a really great place to start when you're looking for a commercial lease.
I've always wondered about this because there was a time when I was toying with this idea of a commercial space, and I never knew if I should be looking at office spaces or retail spaces, because it's really neither of those. Like, you don't want to get yourself into an office space where you're right next door to a lawyer or somebody who doesn't want the noise, but it's not really a retail business either. Do you know anything about like that part of it?
That is such a thoughtful question. Personally, we had unique experiences. Like, our first location was an office space, but it was just a bottom floor and a top floor. We occupied the top floor, and our services were not disruptive to the bottom floor. It was the Autism Society. So it was like they served children, we served children. It worked. My second location that we grew into, we partnered with a dance studio. So it was like, it worked. Retail spaces besides dance studios or karate schools, things like that, really thoughtful, places. Office spaces where you're on the corner might be a thoughtful space. And then we ended up in a standalone, space, sort of. We'll go into that more. But yeah, I think retail space typically has a higher cost than an office space per square foot. And it just has to do a lot with, the visibility. Also parking lots and, lit parking lots and the common area maintenance costs that kind of go into renting a space like that. So your retail spaces are going to be more expensive, but you also get the benefit of the visibility from a marketing standpoint. So you can do them all. I've seen them all done.
Yeah, there's just a lot of factors that you have to consider. And then, like you said, driving around, looking at the space and the parking lot and all of that, the visibility and everything is really helpful. All right. You mentioned potentially a realtor. Are there other business people that you think teachers should get on their team in the beginning? Like maybe a lawyer, accountant? What do you advise?
Absolutely. So there's a few things that I think are just key for your, business development team. And think of it that way. You're developing a business, and, first and foremost, realtors are sometimes helpful, sometimes not, just depends for looking for a space. But first thing first is the accountant and a bookkeeper if you can. The bookkeeper will kind of make the accountant's job a little easier, and they'll help you to organize your financials at the very beginning, when you can really understand the benefits of business ownership from a, financial standpoint, and make sure that you're tracking your expenses. Second thing would be an employment attorney.
Okay. So the bookkeeper, if you didn't get a bookkeeper, then you would be responsible for keeping track of all of that to give to the accountant. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes. And I think one of the things, and I hope I'm not jumping ahead, but one of the things that's really wise to do in your early stages of turning your music teaching into a larger business than just a solo teacher business is knowing that you can delegate to experts and put more time back into doing the things that you love and the things that earn you money.
Yes, that's so wise. I think a lot of times we just want to do it all ourselves, or we think we should do it all ourselves to save money, but that's not necessarily the way the math works. Really, if you can pay somebody to do it much faster and you can use that time to do something else that's profitable.
As an expert too, like they're experts. So their rate of completion is going to be much quicker, more correct.
Let's talk about the money math, because I know this is a place where people get stuck a lot. Give us some guidelines for, thinking and planning for all of this. Like when you hire teachers, they're probably going to be paid a lower rate than what you're used to being paid at earning as a solo teacher. And then you have to think about all the overhead. I think people probably tend to underestimate how much all of this is going to cost, is my guess. But I'm going to let you take it away wherever you want to go with all of that.
Oh, and I want to share the mistake that I made early on so that your listeners can go, wow, like I was thinking the same thing. I'm glad I learned this way. So as I was developing my business, I was just so in love with the teaching. Obviously, you control your earnings based on what you charge and the value that you bring and how many students you see. And when we moved into our first commercial space, there was an intention to grow. We had 3 lesson rooms and like a lobby and a little private restroom. And it was like the perfect next step. And very quickly, people were asking for, I was a singing teacher, so they were looking for instrument lessons. And I started hiring 1 piano teacher and 1 guitar teacher. So really early on, I was like, well, great, they're just going to offset my rent. Like that was my mindset. And so I completely overcompensated them and had to back out of that as we were growing as I matured as a business owner and understood the rent wasn't the only expense that was being incurred. There was rent, utilities, paper, classroom supplies, chairs and tables, instruments, marketing, payment processing, phones, like the list, event costs, the list just goes on and on. And those expenses do compound as your school grows.
I would love for you to share a little more about that and how you coach teachers now to figure out what that rate is going to be.
So I think it really varies on the area that you live in. And I've seen kind of a variation of, there's really a scale, that I think would be wise to consider, that you have an opportunity for your teachers to kind of start somewhere and have room to grow. But, that's like not just like a cut and dry answer. I can tell you kind of where we ended up when we had, 350 private lessons a week, what percentage was paid out to instructor pay. We were at about 33% when we that size. Roughly, we had, I think our tuition rate was around $149 a month. And we had a pay scale that started at $20 an hour and worked all the way up to $38 an hour. So we had teachers earning anywhere from that 20 to that 38. And it was a progressive way for them to start based on experience and teaching time with the studio. There were a lot of factors that would determine, when they would bump up in pay.
Gotcha. And do you have any good advice for how to, speak to the teachers you're hiring about that pay rate, because I've had teachers say, oh, well, I could make so much more if I did this, if I just worked out of my home, which is true, but they don't realize all of the other pieces of it. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. And I think, one of the benefits of being a part of an academy setting is, obviously their job is to come and teach. They're not collecting tuition. They're not managing schedules. They're not worrying about, housekeeping in the space, marketing. The list goes on and on. They're not having to replace a chair that was broken by a student or ruined by an icy that spilled in the lobby and, things like that. But they also don't have the benefit of the culture and like brand experience. Like if you teach from home, what kind of performance opportunities do the students have? And that could be for some kids, this is wonderful. Come to my home, we'll do a concert or a recital at my piano here, and it'll be lovely. But larger schools have the opportunity to put on like these really special events. And the solo teacher doesn't have that. Now, the other thing that they don't realize is it's a lot of like, it's a full-time job to manage a part-time teaching schedule. Now, when they're just teaching part-time, they're just teaching part-time. And the full-time job goes to the business owner that is creating the job for them.
Yeah. I mean, I always tell my teachers, like, you just come here and teach. That's your job. You don't have to do the scheduling. You don't even have to find the students yourself. Like,
emails, none of it.
Yeah. So I think it's a pretty sweet deal, but sometimes all they see is, well, I can make this number at home and this number here. And so, they don't see the full picture. So thank you for explaining that a little bit. Let's talk a little bit more about this money math. I found that piano teachers, we're all very creative, and we also have really big hearts. And we often don't want to overcharge people. We want to make sure we're paying our teachers, enough. And I think a lot of us might also be people pleasers. So, if someone says, I want to get paid more, we're like, oh, okay, I think I can make that work. So how do we take all those beautiful parts of us, but still run a business that's going to be profitable?
I hear this a lot. I think we're all teachers first, right? So there's a certain like personality of a teacher, like you said, but you make the decision to step into entrepreneurship and you have to like develop that muscle, So I think one of the most helpful tidbits of advice on that is having a plan, right? Have a roadmap. Don't just like wing it and say like, I'm just going to pay you this. I don't even know what the local guy is charging for lessons and what they're paying their students, like, or teachers. I don't know. I'm just going to wing it, right? The other thing is feeling like you have to answer on the spot all the time. I think a really incredible tool is to say, you know what? Let me think about that and get back to you. So a teacher comes to you and says, I want to make more. Let me think about that and get back to you. If you didn't set them up with a, this is the roadmap. You're starting here because you've got this much teaching experience. You've got this, on your performance experience, your background as a musician. And every year we're going to see how you're performing here. And that will determine whether or not you receive a raise. If you don't give them that, you're going to have more of the curiosity.
You mentioned that you hired a piano teacher and a guitar teacher. I know I think that's a great way to expand, is hiring other instruments in addition to the one that you teach. Do you have any thoughts about those two models, either a piano teacher hiring a bunch more piano teachers versus hiring a diversity of instruments, maybe some of the pros and cons of those models?
Absolutely. So we really had a reputation in the early stages of being voice, because that's what my background was in. And we kind of did this like teeter-totter, like we would kind of extend the programs and then I would be really slow to add the next, piano teacher or the next guitar teacher to like build that program just based on like what I was attracting, right? And a lot of that had to do with my marketing. So like all the visuals on our social media were like music singers because it was like majority of our school. When I learned how valuable diversity was from a scaling standpoint, when you have a school that is 100%, this is all we do, there's a benefit, right? Because it's like anyone can step in and help. But if your market can only handle X number of experts and X number of students, then all of a sudden the teacher with 36 students, which is a pretty packed after school schedule, leaves. You're like, uh-oh, where am I going to find that teacher? It might take you a couple months, you know? So a diverse team helps just to kind of make those kind of changes that happen throughout the season of running your business a little bit more lower risk, if that makes sense. So I've seen both models. And then the other thing that's interesting is a lot of these schools will get to 100 students when they're starting out and they want to branch out. And it's like, we branded ourselves as guitar of whatever city you live in. And now they're having to do a whole rebrand, new website, new signs, all of that. So I've really seen it all. It just depends on where your passion lies. How large do you want your school to grow? Are you confident in leading musicians in an instrument you're not versed in? I have never played guitar in my life. And I had to trust these other musicians. So I hope that you're doing that right.
I know it is harder for the instruments that we don't play, for sure. I shouldn't admit this on here, but one time I had to step in and teach a ukulele class because the teacher last minute had to cancel. And I'm like, I've never played the ukulele. We're going to figure it out. We're going to talk about how many strings there are, and we're just going to strum them a few times.
But remember, most of your students are beginners. So
right, exactly. I think it was their first class. So we were all on the same page.
Yes.
Yeah. The other thing that I've found is sometimes it can be a little bit of a chicken and an egg scenario where I might have someone ask if we do cello lessons and we don't, but then I'm like, well, do I hire a cello teacher for this one student? Where you have to kind of, I don't know, play the game a little bit to see what the market is. And for some of those instruments like that aren't as common, I've found that teachers are happy to come and just teach one or two students. I have a harp teacher right now who's only had one student for the past couple of years, and she's perfectly willing to come and teach that one student. And now she has another one starting. So very slowly, we're hopefully getting her a few more, but.
Yes. And I would kind of go back to that visibility of it, because it's one out of however many students you have. I'm sure that it's not as visible on your social media, on your website, and perhaps the marketing message adjustment would make an impact on that too. But yeah, we tried kind of less popular instruments over a decade and kind of learned what our expertise was from marketing and delivery of the service.
Yeah, I think that's so true, because the harp teacher actually gave a concert this past weekend with our church organist at the church here. And I think because of that concert, there's a couple more students who are interested because they saw her up there playing and were like, oh, that's interesting. And maybe I could do that.
Sure. Beautiful instrument. That's neat.
Yeah, it's a really cool instrument. So you talked about starting your multi-teacher school, and you mentioned very briefly at the beginning that you eventually sold your school. I would love for you to talk a little bit about that process and how you set it up in a way that would make it attractive to potential buyers.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a gift to build something and then to know when it's time for you to pass it along. And I was really specifically excited about who I was able to sell my brand to. But I think, a consistently growing business that is financially smart and stable from a numbers standpoint is very attractive to a buyer. I think something that's growing steadily is very attractive to a buyer. We also were so fortunate to purchase our final location and built a beautiful facility, something, also I think that though it may or may not actually impact, the success of the teaching experience, it definitely has a community impact. And I think they were excited to, have that as a part of their group. So yeah, I mean, really, it comes down to your bookkeeping, honestly, your ability to get the finances right, Does that make sense?
It makes so much sense. And I think that it scares teachers a little because that's not what we've been trained in. We haven't been trained to be bookkeepers and keep track of the finance.
And I go back to my initial suggestion, correct. We are musicians. Let a bookkeeper handle your books. Let an accountant handle your taxes. Get a coach to help you understand where you can improve on, expenses. Are you spending too much money here? Not enough here? Are you preparing for your taxes to be paid? All of those things.
Yeah, we can't do this alone. I think that's maybe the thing about starting a multi-teacher studio is you can't do it alone and probably be successful, or it's probably pretty rare.
And, it's something that's commonly discussed is how many students a month is that going to cost me to pay for that service? And if you can look at it that way, what's your profit on a teacher or I'm sorry, on a student? I don't know. I can just throw an idea out there. Say your profit when you're a multi-teacher school is $90 a student per month. Okay. How much is a bookkeeper to manage my books for my business once a month? $100? One student to take this off my plate and to do it right.
That's a really good way to look at it. Is there anything else you want to share with teachers about starting a multi-teacher studio or selling a studio or anything that would be helpful to listeners as they're thinking about these things?
Yeah, I think, ultimately the business that you're building is a passion, something that you're starting from your passion. And it does change tremendously when you are a solo teacher to a multi-teacher studio. I have a book recommendation. It's wonderful. And I read this after I hired my second teacher and I was like, wow, this would have been helpful. I strongly encourage any listeners that are thinking about taking this step to read The E-Myth Revisited. It's by Michael Gerber. But essentially, this book talks about going from a solo service provider to having a business based on the service that you provide. Shows you what's gonna become your workload. So I'll share my story. I started as a voice teacher, and then over about 11-year career, I became an expert marketer. I became a recruiter. I became a hirer. I became an HR person. I became a tenant in a lease. I learned how to read leases. So I had learned legal. I learned employment law. I purchased a building. I became a building owner. Just the list of skills that have to develop to go from solo teacher to multi-school teacher owner. Long learning curve. And it took me from the classroom to, overseeing the business.
I'm curious at the end, were you still teaching and what percentage of your time was teaching or was it none?
I stopped teaching, became a mother in 2018. And when he was born, I slowly started letting my students graduate and move on and hiring new teachers. And so for probably the last 4 years probably 4 years of owning the business, I didn't teach at all. My main goal was to work on developing systems in the business. And we haven't even talked about softwares to help you.
I know.
So much. But I had to I got to focus on growing the business. And that in itself is an art form. And I really enjoyed the challenge of that. But yeah, I wasn't teaching at all when I sold the business for years.
Yeah. And I think teachers don't realize how much administrative work they're going to end up doing. And I say that as kind of all encompassing of all of that marketing and
marketing,
landlord and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
Well, Katie, this has been really, really helpful. I think you gave us lots of gold nuggets in this short little chat. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us.
My pleasure. It was so fun.
I I hope that you enjoyed today's episode as much as I did. Katie had so much knowledge to share with music teachers and entrepreneurs, and I am really grateful that she was willing to come on the show today. That's the end of the show for this week, but next week on the podcast, I'm speaking with Amy Webster, and it's a really fun episode all about using improvisation in your studio. I'm going to tell you, even if you already do a lot of improv exercises, I'm pretty sure that Amy will give you some ideas that you haven't heard before. I hope you'll join me again next week. I'm Rachel Ehring, and you've been listening to the Top Music Piano Podcast. I'll talk with you again soon.
How do you keep up to date with all the latest trends and research into music education? How do you connect with other teachers around the world and make sure your teaching stays fresh and relevant for students of all ages and stages, both now and into the future? I created our Top Music Pro membership to be the one-stop shop for music teaching resources, training, support, and community, and I'd love for you to come and join us inside. With over 40 comprehensive training courses, hundreds of teaching demonstrations and lesson plans, free monthly sheet music, discounts, and all the business and pedagogy support you could ever need, Top Music Pro is the community you've been looking for. If you're ready to level up your learning from the podcast and join thousands of other teachers in our global network, head over to topmusicpro.com today.